So Allan, what are the big global trends in petroleum technology?
Well, first I'll start and talk to you about what we're doing, and then I'll take it to a broader context. So in terms of the work that we're doing at the Petroleum Technology Alliance Canada, is we're looking at trying to reduce the environmental footprint of petroleum production. All right, so we're just dealing with the upstream and to a certain extent the midstream. On the demand side, where we talk about fuel substitution and electric vehicles, that's someone else's area. So I just want to give you that context. In terms of what we're doing in Canada, we are well ahead of most of the rest of the world in terms of our environmental stewardship. So some of the big issues we're dealing with, of course, one of them relates to climate change, and it's greenhouse gas emissions. The significant greenhouse gas emission that we're dealing with is methane. Methane is just a simple form of natural gas. And with respect to that, every time we're dealing with either the production of oil or the production of gas, there's the potential for a unexpected or unplanned release of methane. So our role then is to develop technologies and business practices that will reduce that. But in order to reduce it, you need to know where it is, how much it is, when it's happening. And so it's the monitoring and mitigation of methane. We've been working at this for upwards of 15 years, even before the initial agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico in 2015 to reduce emissions. And if you recall, Canada was the only country that actually carried on with that commitment. Immediately after it was signed, both the US and Mexico reversed their commitment to that agreement, but we didn't. So we've been working at this as a country and as a province and Western provinces to minimize the methane release in the production side. So we've been making some great headway, and as I mentioned before, we've been we're much farther ahead in terms of the technologies available to reduce emissions. As a result of the work that the industry has been doing in Western Canada, we've developed the capacity to reduce site emissions by 48%. Now that's capacity. It doesn't mean that everyone's installed all the pieces of equipment to get the 48%, because it's a number of different solutions. You got to put them together at each site to get to the 48%. But we've been on the path to reduce this for at least the last 7 to 8 years. And in the 3 Western provinces, we are at least 40% reduction in methane emissions now. And so we will most likely meet or exceed the regulatory requirements by 2025, which is the 45%.
What about on the methane emissions side, the measurement issue? Because there have been studies that show that the national inventory of methane emissions is low. In fact, the inventory is likely to be 1.5 to 2 times larger than it's been estimated. What's your take on that?
Well, that's definitely possible, but we also have to think about how we started. When we first started, we developed engineering estimates. So our initial benchmarks were all calculations, no direct observation, right? And if you think about the way we understand gas mileage for a vehicle, you get the sticker value and then you get the actual value. And the sticker value is more often than not much better than the actual value. So what we're seeing is learnings. We're seeing direct observations now, and we're correcting those numbers from before. So this is just the industry and government and all the stakeholders combined learning as we go. So we're developing better numbers, right? And we will continue to develop better numbers. And the need for reduction hasn't changed, right? And the need to make sure we are minimizing all of the potential leaks and damaged equipment hasn't changed either. So we're on that path, but we're just learning as we go.
What's your take on the adoption of methane measurement equipment in Western Canada. Like I'm talking about GHG sniffing satellites. I'm talking about drones. Talking about remote sensing technologies. I assume that the industry, or may we assume that the industry is adopting those rapidly, or
Yes,
not?
yes, they are. So the debate right now is what is the right strategy? So there are many components to the strategy. There's direct on-site measurement, but you can on-site measure the site or on-site measure the pieces of equipment. You can drive around the site. That's another on-site measurement. You can bring drones across. You can bring airplanes across. You can go over with satellites. Each of those has a different level of accuracy and precision. And then you determine what you need in order to fix the problem that you're finding. What we're finding mostly is that there's the 80-20 rule, which is 80% of the emissions is due to a small number of what we call super emitters. Most of the sites are doing pretty well, as expected, no big surprises. And then there's those smaller number of sites that are responsible for more. So that's where you get into this strategy of using the high level, high resolution, or sorry, I should say low resolution monitors, and then going to the more on-site monitors to fine tune your estimates. So it's what we're dealing with right now is what is the strategy? How much on-site, how much satellite, how much plane, how much drone?
What other kinds of petroleum technologies are you seeing being adopted by the industry?
We're seeing, of course, I think the big thing is the move from pneumatic devices that are powered by associated gas to pneumatic devices that are either powered by compressed air, or they're electric devices, right? So that's the big thing that has moved us very close to this 45%. The next challenge is, of course, where we get to with the inherent efficiency levels of the equipment. So what is the efficiency of a stationary engine, right? How do we make it better so it combusts more cleanly? That's what we call methane slip. The methane doesn't get burned and it gets ejected in the exhaust. So we're looking at catalysts. We're looking at post-exhaust combustion of the methane, because methane, even though it's a much smaller quantity of gases emitted per volume compared to carbon dioxide, it makes up for that by being having a very significant global warming potential. So even converting the methane into CO2 is a big benefit.
What about the adoption of new technologies that have been developed in Alberta? And the reason I ask this question is because I've interviewed several technology developers, and while they are partnering within industry, they've identified a number of speed bumps along the way. Some of them come from the provincial government, some of them come from the federal government, some of them come from industry itself, and they all work together to slow down the adoption of technologies that could reduce emissions quite significantly if they were adopted. So what are you seeing in that space?
I'm not seeing anything different from my experience and understanding of the adoption of any new equipment in any sector in Canada. It takes time for new equipment to be understood and adopted, because not only when you adopt it, you may have to change your operating practices. You're definitely going to have to change your maintenance practices. So all that comes as a package. So even when the equipment is ready to go, there's still a lot to be done around it. And I'll give you an example, not necessarily from the oil and gas sector. I was at a pulp and paper plant once, and I saw a standard efficiency electric motor sitting on the ground covered in dirt that was just chugging away doing its job. And in the back room, there was two high efficiency motors just sitting on a shelf. And I asked the fellas, the guys that were responsible for maintaining it, says, why, you think, because they've already bought it, right? Why haven't you installed that? Well, we don't know anything about that. So they didn't necessarily have the training. So these are standard challenges that we have for any new technology.
What is the industry doing to overcome those challenges? Because I think it's fair to say that the pressure on the industry to reduce emissions now is fairly intense. And the carbon price is going up, so that adds additional pressure on companies. And you would think that, I'm going to assume here, that then they would be more attuned to obstacles to adoption like the one you just described, and they'd be acting more quickly to overcome those.
Well, again, we have various sizes of companies. They have various levels of capacity, both in terms of human resources and money. And so each will take its own time to move through its process. And it's not the only thing that they're dealing with. They're also dealing with other aspects of their business in order to make it more efficient to operationalize new things. It could be as simple as building in an SAP system into a company. That takes time, effort. So companies are doing this. They're meeting and exceeding their obligations right now. So if you're saying, well, why aren't they doing it faster? They seem to be, from my experience, they seem to be doing it pretty fast, given all the challenges that companies have, not just energy companies, to manage their activities. So I'm not seeing any significant delays in the application of new technologies, any more than you would typically see for anything, even including other regulatory requirements, maybe related to health, safety, or what have you. They're being done at the pace of change that companies can manage.
Allan, what would be the number one technology trend in the oil and gas industry that you're watching?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, here at PTAC, we're dealing with a whole bunch of different environmental issues, but by far the biggest one is related to methane reduction. And I think the biggest issue with respect to methane reduction, after we've done all the low-hanging fruit, if you will, is the methane slip from incomplete combustion. And that could come from compressors, it could come from stationary engine, and it can even come from flare stacks. So that's the issue. Now, the monitoring side, we've done a lot of work, and I've talked about the strategy of it. Now we really got to get to how do we eliminate that excess methane that's coming through these systems. So we're looking, I think the biggest thing right now would be the catalysts or other approaches to improve the combustion efficiency of those devices.
What would be the second biggest trend not related to methane?
Second biggest trend not related to methane, it would be species at risk. So it's not air, it's species at risk on the ground. And the biggest challenge there is not necessarily whether we know which species are at risk, is we don't know. We have a lot of species that are flagged in our legislation for species at risk simply because we have no idea what's going on. So we have to be looking at more foundational information about the species to even know that whether they are at risk. And understanding that factual evidence is very important because it can have implications in terms of the exploration phase of oil and gas, the operational phase, and the decommissioning and reclamation phase. And if you don't know what's going on, it makes it extremely difficult to do those things effectively.
If you were looking ahead the next 5 or 10 years, I won't ask you to look ahead any further than that, but if you were looking ahead 5 or 10 years, what new technology or issue would you expect to emerge that will capture the industry's attention?
The efficiency of flare stacks. The federal government, in its discussion documentation of fall of 2022, identified flare stacks as being an area of interest for them to look at when they are considering increasing the reduction requirements by industry. And right now, what that would mean is a very strong confluence between making these flare stacks more efficient again, going to the methane slip issue, and allowing them to be there as that safety mechanism, which was their original intent in case of pressure upsets. So how do you get those two things working together, right? Want to deal with it in terms of global warming, but you also want to make sure that your sites are safe for your crews and the people around there.
Well, Allan, thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.